In the previous video, I talked about the explicit history of black metal, going as deep as I could into every little album, event, or certain subgenre within black metal that made it special and unique within its whole history, doing as much research as I possibly could. Which, in the long run, I felt is one of the better videos I have done to my own personal standards. So I want to carry that approach forward and now talk about the explicit history of death metal. Death metal is one of the many subgenres you'll find in metal that puts a lot of emphasis on speed, aggression, and brutality. Signature traits that you'll notice immediately, for one, would be the vocals, as they have a lot of these guttural executions that at first listen are nearly impossible to decipher if you're new to it. Then you have the complexity of the guitar riffs, really tremolo picked at times, has a lot of distortion, and is tuned really low. To the drum performances that are typically executed at breakneck speeds, whether it be the drum fills that are played so fast that it sounds equivalent to a machine gun being blasted, to most of the percussions and rhythm patterns that you'll hear, typically in vein of like skank beats or blast beats, that when it comes to the overall speed of the drum performances on most death metal albums, you'll notice that they will exceed well over, most of the time, 200 BPM and up. And of course, there's the lyrical themes that have to match up with everything else that you're hearing sonically, as typically what you'll hear, or at least see, with death metal is that album artwork is a lot more violent and grotesque. Lyrical themes, if you can decipher what they're saying or look up the lyrical content, typically will have to do again with violence, destruction, Armageddon, Satanism, and more often than not, blood and gore. If you were to do a quick oversight of the history of death metal from beginning to end, you'll notice that within the spectrum of extreme metal, death metal has been around the longest, with the only other form of extreme metal predating it being thrash metal. Because of its long and extensive history, there is so much death metal out there to explore in its back catalog. So much so that according to the Metal Archives, if you were to search bands up by subgenre, it states that death metal has the most listed within the archives of over 60,000, and it's still growing to this day. When it comes to the origins for death metal, most people would cite the year 1984 for the birth year for death metal. But I would say even years prior, in the early 80s, before death metal was a thing, we really need to cite thrash metal for being this harbinger and planting the seeds for what death metal was going to become. What I mean by this is during the early 80s, thrash metal was as extreme as it got, blending forms of heavy metal and forms of hardcore punk together, and this is where bands like Motorhead, Slayer, Metallica, and Venom were really being like at the head helm of what was like the most aggressive stuff for their time. Even though none of these acts are playing in the style of death metal, it's important to cite this here because when it comes to the forefathers of death metal that I'll be talking about in a brief moment here, is they all looked at these acts as the blueprints of what they could build off of. Because when it comes to the evolution of just metal as a whole, it seems like throughout the years bands want to push the envelope, be heavier, more extreme, or faster, and clearly this is the case when it comes to the origins and the earliest evolution of death metal. What's often cited for being the first death metal band to emerge would be Possessed. Their debut release was a demo back in 1984 called Death Metal, where a lot of people connect this demo as to how this subgenre got its name. During that exact same year in 1984, on the East Coast in Florida, Death would release their debut demo, Death by Metal. Both demos clock in at roughly around either 10 or 15 minutes long, and they both have this very grainy DIY low-budget production value to it, but for the historical context for death metal, this is where the style of music all began, as all the attributes I talked about in the beginning of this video, you'll find it on these demos. Personally, what I find to be quite the coincidence here is that While both Death and Possessed are credited for being the first death metal band, is that when it comes to their debut releases, somehow they both managed to have the words death and metal in it. Yet when it comes to their debut full-length albums, Possessed came out first in 1985 with 7 Churches. As I'm sure most of you are aware of this if you're a fan of death metal, Possessed 7 Churches is an absolute essential and staple for anything that has to do with death metal to begin with, as it's a mixture of obviously death metal and a strong essence of thrash metal embedded when it comes to the guitar riffs and drum performance. That really what this album always reminded me of is, think of early Slayer like Show No Mercy. The same kind of rhythm patterns with the guitar riffs and the percussions. It's just the vocals are a lot deeper and harsher. When it comes to the debut full-length album by Death, Scream Bloody Gore, that would be released a few years later in 1987. Musically, it does have elements of both obviously death metal and forms of thrash metal. However, if you know the whole, legacy of Death, is that there was starting to become forms of some kind of progressive tendencies, at least when it comes to like intros and outros on this album with certain songs. But the meat and potatoes of it is death metal and other elements of thrash metal embedded here. It's just the big difference, I guess, is in terms of lyrical themes. Chuck Schuldiner during this time had a lot of fascination with horror movies, and just by the album artwork and some of the song titles, it's quite apparent. Just like in the previous video where I talked about black metal, there was always the conversation of who was the first black metal band, Venom or Bathory. Well, in this case, when it comes to death metal, this conversation eerily resembles that of who was the first, Possessed or Death. Personally, I don't think this debate is as heated as the Venom and Bathory thing, because most people cite Possessed for being the first death metal band. However, people argue that Death was the first because, in their defense, Possessed, even though it came out with their debut full-length album 7 Churches in '85, had a strong resemblance of thrash metal, whereas when it comes to Death, with Scream Bloody Gore, released in 1987, people would argue that that is the first true example of pure death metal. So, just like in the previous video of, who was the first black metal band, I'll give my own personal thoughts. I don't think there is an objective answer to this. If you want to agree or disagree with me, definitely let me know in the comments. But I've always viewed it that Possessed was the first death metal band. Even if the argument is they had more elements of thrash metal, again, death metal was built off of thrash metal, so it makes sense that they would have that, and they clearly showcase a lot of death metal elements, again, especially when it comes to the vocal performance and overall aggression on 7 Churches. If we're looking at full-length albums, then yeah, 7 Churches, in my personal view, is the first full-length death metal album. However, if you wanted to counter-argue that Death is the first true death metal band because it embodied it to its fullest extent and really started to evolve with death metal in the coming years, I can totally see your argument there. What makes this conversation even all the more of a coincidence from the first black metal band is, again, with the first black metal band, it was Venom or Bathory. Then there's, Hellhammer that was doing roughly the same exact thing during the same exact time. Well, when it comes to death metal, again, there's very similar results here. You have the conversation between Possessed or Death being the first, and then there was a third band that isn't brought up all that much, but was doing basically the same exact thing in 1984, that being Necrophagia. These guys formed, again, in the same exact time period of 1984, and their lyrical themes were all about, gore and horror in that macabre-esque type of way. Again, very similar to what Death did, only they started it from day one with their demo, Death is Fun. Even though Necrophagia didn't get nearly as much fan recognition or commercial success as either Death or Possessed, they're absolutely worth mentioning here within the context for the history of death metal, as they formed in the mid-80s when Death and Possessed started. Their lyrical themes, presentation, and overall sound embodies what death metal is all about. And I feel like for anyone who is a death metal connoisseur that wants to listen to any and all death metal, Necrophagia is a must-know. Before we go any further, one thing I want to address that I find really interesting when it comes to the origins and earliest beginnings for this subgenre is that when you look at possessed, death, and necrophagia, death metal never had this proto phase. Yeah, you can argue death thrash, but it still has the word death metal embedded in it, and death metal was just running off the backs of thrash metal to begin with, just faster, more aggressive, and harsher vocals right from the start. It never had this proto phase. Where black metal, it did. It, like proto black metal, first wave black metal. You have elements in retrospect to black metal when you look back at it, but it wouldn't become fully fleshed out like purely black metal until a decade later in the 90s. Whereas I stated with death metal, its forefathers, it started off as death metal and it ran with it. And it would really, I think, help accelerate all of these other death metal bands to come. Because as I stated, there is just this endless horde of death metal bands out there. The explosion of death metal bands wouldn't really happen until the late 80s and early 90s, which we'll get to that in a second. But when it comes to the mid 80s, around the same time period of death, possessed, and necrophagia, there seemed to be bits and pieces of what resembled death metal popping forth. Noteworthy names, of course, would be Sepultura with their debut full-length album from 1986, Morbid Visions, which, yes, I always find myself talking about the Brazilian thrash metal scene at some point when it comes to the development for anything that has to do with fast, aggressive, extreme metal. And make no mistake about it, Sepultura, along with just basically the rest of the Brazilian thrash scene, plays a vital role into the earliest developments for it. As again, yet it's mostly thrash metal, but they were starting to blend other forms of extreme metal that were starting to come forth, and death metal was in their formula, and you can clearly hear it on Morbid Visions. I've also seen conversation that Creator's debut full-length album from 1985, Endless Pain, is a form of like death thrash, which, yes, I'm very aware Creator is one of the big titans to German thrash metal, and I'm not stating that they're a death metal band somehow, but for its time in 1985, when you really listen to just how rugged the vocals are and just how insanely aggressive and just militant the overall just vibe and execution of the instrumentals, people kind of connect this to eerily resembling or being very close and adjacent to, just the sounds and styles of death metal. Then there's Messiah, a death thrash band based out of Switzerland that back in 1986 released their debut full-length album, Hymn to a Bromulan, which very raw, fast-paced death metal with, again, a lot of thrashy guitar riffs that was just, a product of its time for like extreme metal in the mid-80s, but still quite relevant to the conversation of this video. Other bands worth mentioning that had the vocal execution of death metal along with its aggression, but also having these very thrashy like guitar riffs, would be stuff like Numbskull, Incubus, Sadist, and Poison. But of all the extreme metal bands that were coming out during the mid-80s, if you had to ask me which one embodied death metal to its fullest extent that was just pure death metal, there wasn't even the slightest sliver of thrash, like, again, unadulterated death metal in its earliest form, to my personal view, that would have to go to Necrovore with their 1987 demo. It's only 15 or 16 minutes long, but Jesus Christ, this is raw and primitive for its time. And even for today's standards, there are so many death metal bands that want to replicate this sound, that want that raw, primal aggression, and Necrovore had it. It's a shame, though, that they never really amalgamated to anything more than just, 2 demos during the mid-80s. And from what it states on the Metal Archives is that they tried to get either David Vincent or Trey Azagoth from Morbid Angel to join, but that didn't come to fruition. But Necrovore is kind of viewed as, for the people who at least know of it, this massive hidden gem that's been buried by all other death metal bands that came either before or after it. But in my personal view, if you want like the purest, earliest form of death metal, unadulterated, it goes to Necrovore. Fast forward a couple of years to the late 80s and early 90s, and this is where death metal really came into fruition, and this is where so many things would happen within death metal, from the beginning of legacy acts that we all cherish today, to sounds and attributes that would be carried over for decades to come, to all of this innovation that so many other death metal bands would use as blueprints to carry over with other generations for this style of music, there is just so freaking much to talk about here. First and foremost, it goes without saying, but during this time period for death metal, there were two locations that were absolutely thriving on the map. That, of course, being Florida and Sweden. At face value, both Florida and Sweden follow the basic definition of what makes death metal what it is. However, when it comes to their overall characteristics, there are some noticeable differences. For example, when it comes to the Florida death metal scene, or in this case, as most people call it, the Floridian death metal scene, is that it always came off sounding faster and more aggressive. Typically, what ends up happening with a lot of Florida death metal albums is, because of it being faster, you notice blast beats are executed a lot more. It has a lot more aggression with it. It has more of a raw sound. And maybe that has to do with the fact that since thrash metal was kind of thriving at this point in the United States, they were kind of basing a lot of that aggression off of that kind of like rhythm patterns, only just making it faster and again, more aggressive. Whereas when it comes to Swedish death metal and its overall characteristics, is even though it's not played as fast as the Floridian death metal scene, you can cherry pick here and there bands that were utilizing blast beats, but for the most part you'll notice bands utilize it within the rhythm sections and percussions that's more mid-tempo, that utilize skank beats or D beats, that would become more of this, again, mid-paced style of death metal. But what it lacks in aggression and speed, it makes up for with its guitar riffs and melodies, as it comes off a lot more melodic. And because of this very gloomy type of guitar playing that they have at points, it gives off this atmospheric and cryptic-like sound. To make this as straightforward as possible, without bouncing back and forth between these two locations, I'll start off talking about the Floridian death metal scene, and then right after talk about the Swedish death metal scene with all of its standouts. When it comes to standouts within the Floridian death metal scene that made it such a special place when it started, of course we got to talk about Death, the band I just talked about earlier on in this video, with their first three albums, that of course being Scream Bloody Gore, Leprosy, my personal favorite, and Spiritual Healing, which at this point Chuck Schuldiner and company, whenever he had different members because it was always changing, would really hone in their craft to really fleshing out what death metal was capable of within its purest form. Then of course there's the legendary Morbid Angel with their debut full-length album from 1989, Altars of Madness. In my personal view, this is the epitome of anything that has to do with evil, sinister, sounding, and visually appealing death metal. What makes this album just so significant, besides it being attached with Morbid Angel, who's a legacy act that have influenced countless bands generations later, is that this album really helped popularize the usage of blast beats in death metal. While they weren't the first band to use blast beats in extreme metal, if anything that would have to be credited to, more in the grindcore realm, like for example, Napalm Death with Mick Harris is often credited as being the first extreme musician to utilize blast beats. And it's also worth mentioning that blast beats originated in jazz music, which a lot of people don't seem to know there. But in terms of blast beats used in death metal, this is where it kind of really started. And it's worth crediting their drummer at the time, Pete Sandoval, as he was also in Terrorizer at this point. So that influence of grindcore when it comes to all of that blasting that's like really spiraling out of control and wild, really, again, this is where death metal started utilizing that approach and makes this album just so significant. Then of course you have Deicide, that in terms of lyrical themes is adjacent to that with Morbid Angel, of it being evil and sinister. It's just, they're way more upfront and in your face, as it's very anti-religious, anti-Christian, very anti-God, as Glenn Benton makes that very apparent with every interview and every album title, regardless of what time period or era you look at this band's discography. It's just worth mentioning here that when it comes to their songwriting and execution, just as pulverizing as Morbid Angel, it's just with the vocal approach with Glenn Benton, he really likes utilizing extra layers with his execution. But not every band that came out of Florida relied on fast-paced aggression to be the driving force of their approach. Take, for example, Obituary with their debut full-length album, Slowly We Rot, where a lot of their inspirations and ideas came from Celtic Frost, of again it being slower, gritty, and this gloomy, semi-doom-esque approach with their guitar riffs that, as much of an oxymoron as this sounds, I would state for their time, Obituary was the most European-sounding American death metal band. Although Florida is known for having aggressive death metal bands, they also had quite a handful of experimental death metal as well. Take, for example, Cynic and Atheist, who at their core foundation, it's death metal, but they would experiment with forms of jazz fusion, which at the time was quite groundbreaking and cutting edge compared to everything else, because no one was going down these different routes and blending, outside forms of extreme metal into their overall songwriting. And what's interesting about both of them is while they both play death metal with jazz fusion, it's in two different ways. As when it comes to Atheists, their approach is like death metal and being it really thrashy while incorporating jazz. So even when they're playing the jazz moments on their albums like Unquestionable Presence, it still would be really pulverizing because they never sacrifice the death metal or extreme metal moments on this album. As where it comes to Cynic, with their approach of death metal and jazz fusion, it's a bit more psychedelic and really kind of forms of psychedelic rock as well, considering the fact that Paul Masvidal would incorporate clean singing but with this filter to make it sound really alien-like in some sense, but also psychedelic, that they would go down more of a trippy experimental region, I always thought. Either way, both Cynic and Atheist for their time were just such cutting-edge bands. Another cutting-edge band in the Floridian death metal scene, of course, would be Nocturnus with their album, The Key. What makes this quite significant is it's cited as they are the first ever death metal band to utilize keyboards with their songwriting and go within the region now of this sci-fi, futuristic, lyrical themes that again was very different from everything else being very violent, gory, or evil and sounding in this anti-religious way. That definitely should be stated as well for being something ahead of the curve for utilizing keyboards, which was just again unheard of in the early 90s. Other death metal bands worth mentioning that were coming out of Florida during this time would be Hell Witch, Brutality, Massacre, and Solstice. Now, to address the elephant in the room as one of the biggest death metal bands ever within its overall timeline that came out of Florida as well, of course, would be Cannibal Corpse. It's a safe bet to say that if you know what death metal is, you know who Cannibal Corpse are. From their ultra-violent and brutal sound, the monstrous vocals at the time for Chris Barnes, the pummeling blast beats, and the very signature artwork all done still to this day by Vincent Locke, Cannibal Corpse is basically the total package for anything and everything that has to do with what people perceive as death metal. All of those components are some of the many reasons as to why Cannibal Corpse was and still is to this day the highest selling death metal band going right now. As for the other reasons, I'll touch upon that in a little bit, but first I want to tell you guys all about the Swedish death metal scene. One of the most legendary Swedish death metal albums that would become such a signature staple for what the sound would be, of course, would go to Entombed with their debut full-length album, Left Hand Path. Even though every single song on this album stands shoulder to shoulder with one another, carrying the same formula and structure from the previous on to the track after, what makes this album just so signature is that it would become such a staple for Swedish death metal because it's known for creating the buzzsaw guitar tone, mainly having to do with the HM2 guitar pedal, which so many bands would utilize and follow the blueprints to really make Swedish death metal its own unique entity within the spectrum. Other noteworthy names that are just legends whenever the conversation of Swedish death metal is brought up, of course, would be Dismember, Unleashed, and Grave. All of these bands mentioned here have that HM2 guitar tone of that buzzsaw-like effect, where they would also utilize these very gloomy melodic melodies in certain points to give off something very heavy yet cryptic with their approach. As great as all of those bands are, for me personally, the band that I always think of when I hear the word Swedish death metal, for some reason I always think of the band Crematory. Crematory was a really short-lived Swedish death metal band that only had a handful of demos and one EP called Denial. But what I've always enjoyed about it so much is not just, the image and the overall sound is really just old school, moldy, and, harsh and raw sounding. But to me personally, how they did their songwriting, it's like, what if Morbid Angel at this point was from Sweden instead of, the United States? Because they have a lot of blast beats utilized into their sound. It has that grinding type of spiraling out of control whirlwind of like blast beats and riffs going all over the place. And that would be something they would utilize when this band disbanded, as later on the members would form gore grind bands such as Regurgitation and General Surgery. So clearly they were kind of embedded with that kind of, death grind, gore grind, grindcore type of sound. So to me personally, I guess Crematory has always clicked with me more because they still have the gloomy, old school kind of melodies of Swedish death metal, but the just barbarity and aggression that Morbid Angel was doing. To me at least, they were always like the total package of Swedish death metal for my own taste. While we're on the topic of everything that's coming out of Sweden, I'd be doing you guys a disservice if I didn't bring up the soulful nth album by Gorment, The Ending Quest. This is everything that embodies that gloomy sound that makes the Swedish death metal scene oh so special. It's just here what I always find it to be a bit more distinct, and it's I think a huge reason as to why people just respect and cherish the living hell out of it, is this comes off sounding a bit more emotive from everything else. And I feel like that has to do with the fact that at certain portions on this album, yeah, you have obviously death metal being played that's quite heavy and aggressive, but there's this weird essence of gothic tendencies popping forth at certain points within the album, at least when it comes to some of the acoustic guitar playing on here, and it just really cuts a bit deeper with that emotive aspect. And I've always looked at this album by Gorment to be something quite special. And if you're looking for something very similar to Gorment, I would immediately recommend the soulful nth album by God Macabre, The Winter Long, released in 1993. Just like Gorment, it's dark, heavy, cryptic, yet emotive death metal that doesn't sacrifice any of the heavy components you would want in this style of music. I would say overall within the broad spectrum of Swedish death metal, it's an essential, but for death metal as a whole, it's kind of like this unappreciated gem that doesn't get talked about enough. I also need to mention Carnage with their 1990 full-length album Dark Recollections, which in retrospect for a lot of people this is considered to be one of the first ever death metal supergroups, as when you look at the lineup it contains members or had members of either Dismember, Entombed, Candlemass, or Dark Tranquility, and again just another like essential when it comes to Swedish death metal as a whole. Earlier in this video I discussed that one of the distinct characteristics that was going on in Sweden is that they put a lot more emphasis now on melody with their guitar playing and songwriting approach. And that would become all the more apparent about, early 90s, 91, 92, when the Gothenburg scene in Sweden started exploding. This is where the style known as melodic death metal came into fruition, and this was popularized and emphasized all the more thanks to bands like At the Gates, Dark Tranquility, and In Flames. A handful of years ago I made a video all about defending melodic death metal and what makes it, distinct from like regular death metal. Now to be fair, every single death metal band you come across from the origins, present day, and everything in between all has melody to some certain extent. It's just when you find bands that are labeled under melodic death metal, they just put so much more emphasis on melody that it's kind of like this give and take for a lot of death metal fans. What I mean by this is You might find more accessibility and easy listenings with death metal when they put more melody with it. It's just what you get with melody, you're sacrificing with brutality. Hence why, from what I've noticed within the death metal fan base, it has like this love-hate relationship. Some think of it as it's a give and take. You're getting melody, but sacrifice and brutality, so it's not as aggressive, it's not as primitive, and becomes a bit more accessible, which I understand. And during the mid-90s and early 2000s, again, getting ahead of myself here, is there would be this just onslaught of all different melodeath bands coming out that all kind of sounded the same, or they would change their style to capitalize on that approach. Take, for example, Carcass, that was this grotesque, gritty, gore grind, grindcore band, and during the mid-90s they capitalized on the sound with Heartwork, of a more melodic death metal take that was a bit more approachable. That to some people they're sacrificing that intense sound for something more digestible, which I understand. It's just, I always find myself defending it, because when bands can balance out melody and brutality 50-50, it just works wonders. I mean, for example, Intestine Balsam with their album Anatomy of the Beast, a band from Japan that clearly takes influence from the Swedish death metal scene. It's just some of the best death metal I've ever heard, just overall, and one of my personal favorites that I've always just been such a fanboy for. That I understand it can be quite oversaturated and a lot of bands sound the same, but when it clicks, God, it's just perfection. And in my personal view, Intestine Balsam is a perfect example of that. But getting back on track here, it's just, again, when it comes to melody being incorporated within death metal, Sweden is heavily to be credited. Before I close out this portion talking about, 90s Swedish death metal, I do want to include Opeth, which I know they formed in 1990 but didn't release anything until like 1995, so they were like a handful of years late to the party of like capitalizing on the Swedish death metal scene. But regardless, they're from Sweden, and what makes them significant is they showcase that death metal can have a little bit more dynamics to it, meaning that it doesn't always have to be heavy. Even though their debut full-length album is the most unadulterated death metal album in their discography, it showcased there was forms of melancholy. It showcased that even during this portion, Michael Ackerfeld, the mastermind behind Opeth, still had a fondness of like prog rock and 70s prog rock, like King Crimson, that he always talks about being a big influence to him. And showcased again that the dynamics of death metal were kind of expanding upon even as early as 1995. Last minute additions that I want to include for Sweden would be Edge of Sanity, Thentanex, Therion, and Vomitory. Now that I've established the band's standouts and characteristics of both the Floridian and Swedish death metal scene, one question that people tend to point out when looking at this in retrospect within the timeline is, how did death metal become so popular? How did it gain so much commercial success? Because if you look up online the best-selling death metal bands, the best-selling death metal albums, even though this information only goes up to the year of 2003, it's still quite significant, is that it states that Cannibal Corpse is the highest selling death metal band, which at the time of 2003 was a little over 500,000 records sold, and the highest selling death metal album overall would be Morbid Angel's Altars of Madness. I know this is a very odd reference to use at this point in the video, but I remember a handful of years back, the Punk Rock NBA made a video all about what killed death metal. And I remember him asking as to how death metal sold so well in the 90s, but nowadays we don't see death metal bands selling the way that they are now. And wondering as to it just fizzled out, that's it lost relevancy, blah blah blah, that other stuff that he brings up. And I think there's a lot of components he brushed over as to how death metal for the early 90s was just selling so well. First reason being it's fresh, it's new, and that's something regardless of what genre, subgenre, or niche little thing you can think of. When something is fresh and hot out of the oven for their audience, people will immediately buy it up because it's different. And for death metal during its time, that clearly showcases the reason as to why it had such a big appeal for its time. Second reason is death metal in the early 90s and late 80s compared to now was a lot more concentrated in certain areas and didn't have as many names as we have now. I mean, back then, it was probably a small fraction of what it is now. So if you liked death metal in the late 80s and early 90s, you were enjoying basically all that death metal offered. Whereas today, if you enjoy death metal, it doesn't matter how much you dive into the scene of death metal, there's always going to be more to come, that it's not concentrated on just a handful of acts. Third reason is because of it being new and fresh, mainstream media was kind of perceiving it as something they couldn't really, identify or decipher the true intentions of what this music was. Because, let me remind you, Cannibal Corpse went through quite the controversy during their time, as, they had the whole parental advisory stickers. I remember the Florida congressman was trying to, censor some of their stuff, and all that did was help sell their records because it gained more attention to them, because, again, controversy sells. People kind of forget that, and Cannibal Corpse used that to their advantage. Thus, you have all these new individuals and a new audience to dive into death metal all the more, again, when it was still fresh and new during the early 90s. And because of it being new and fresh, there were all of these different outlets having attention to it. Let me remind you, MTV back then was a lot different than it is now, because they actually, showcased music. And that's when they had stuff like Headbangers Ball, where, you would have these episodes go on run times, I believe, from what I looked up, around an hour and a half to 3 hours long, just, playing and talking about, metal music, whether it be traditional, thrash, or death metal. It was being discussed on television. With it being discussed on television, if you search hard enough, you'll find some of these legacy acts being on different channels. For example, back in the late 80s, you can find this and it's funny, Deicide, back when they were called Amon, was on a PBS station fundraiser. Okay, Deicide doing a fundraiser on PBS. That is something you can say in a sentence that happened. Or this other instance, which I swear to God, this looks like a fever dream. There was this talk show, I believe in the early 90s. I can't find the name of what this show was called, but you can look it up, where it was a talk show discussing police violence, and in the conversation was Tupac and David Vincent from Morbid Angel. And of course, what I would say is the biggest moment for death metal in pop culture history would be when Cannibal Corpse was in a scene in the movie Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, which, even though they were only in it for I think 5 or 10 minutes, their music being played of a hammer smashed face, still, there is a scene where Jim Carrey, the star of the film, is on stage with Cannibal Corpse, and you can see their logo behind him, and this was very monumental. Because back in 1994, Ace Ventura: Pet Detective made in the box office over $100 million, which I know for today's standards that's a flop, which is scary to think about, how much inflation has been fucked over, but back then, this was absolutely monumental for Cannibal Corpse and just death metal as a whole being within the public's eye. While I have faith that the diehards will enjoy this music for years to come, when the question arises as to how it can be as commercially successful as it was, 30 plus years ago, is I feel like back then there was a lot of things that lined up for death metal in its favor. Again, like a congressman trying to censor out, albums in the style of death metal. All that's going to want to do is make people listen to it more, because no one wants to hear a politician tell them what they can and can't enjoy, to, it being in pop culture a little bit more, like Ace Ventura or some of the musicians being on talk shows, to it being new and fresh and people wanting to see what extreme forms of music can sound like, because again, it being new and unheard of. I just feel like for its time period, death metal came out in the best way possible to sell records to people who have never heard of it. Whereas, again, for today's standards, there's just so much of it, it's hard to have a bunch of people concentrate on just one specific thing altogether. At this point, I've only discussed Florida and Sweden for this style of music. And I also stated in the beginning of this video that death metal has the most amount of bands and there is so much to cover. So let me tell you here that we're still stuck in the early 90s and I haven't even begun to scratch the surface of all of the just, gems that were being released consistently throughout the years. As incredible as the Floridian death metal scene was, up north during the same time period, the New York State had a lot of death metal activity. Noteworthy names, of course, would be Baphomet, Morpheus Descends, and Malevolent Creation. However, what the New York death metal scene is mainly known for is transcending death metal from it being extreme to ultra brutal, because this is where brutal death metal or slam death metal starts to become a thing, and this is where bands like Suffocation would really start to enhance death metal to the next level, which I would get more into the New York death metal scene with like brutal death metal and slam, but I really do feel like brutal death metal or slam death metal deserves its own like explicit history video, so I'll save that for another day. But since I brought up New York death metal, what's right next door to it being New Jersey, I need to mention Ripping Corpse with their soulful length album from 1991, Dreaming with the Dead. This is just savage, primitive death thrash that I've been wanting for oh so long to be repressed on vinyl. I know this is such a basic, generic, metalhead description to say, but the riffs on this goddamn thing do not let up. If you want just ear candy of death metal and thrash metal being just played again at just savage degrees, you need to know this and you need to check this gem out. Going back over to Europe, another country that really started flourishing with death metal would be Finland. What makes all of the bands that came out of Finland have their own distinct sound is it's somewhat adjacent to that to Sweden, where it's gloomy and cryptic. However, Finland put a little bit more emphasis on like doom metal aspects with some of their bands, and I always felt like Finnish death metal was a bit more unorthodox and denser when it came to their production and songwriting. One standout band that always sticks in my mind when it comes to Finnish death metal, applying both death metal and doom metal together, would be Revitalism. They only had 2 demos during the 90s, and I believe they reformed and did like a follow-up demo like 20 years later, if memory serves me right. But regardless, their first demos are widely received positively because not only is a early example to that of death metal and doom metal, or death doom in this case, but they're credited for being the first death metal band to perform vocals in their native language, that of course being Finnish. You have Amorphous, which is like arguably the most successful death metal band to come out of Finland, even though as of lately they've really changed their style for more like progressive rock tendencies. But when you listen to their early full-length albums, it's just pure death doom as it kind of got, and laid out the blueprints for other bands to follow. Another band worth mentioning too for like Finnish death doom, of course, would be Unholy, where they play it even slower and more atmospheric, and again, just another staple for the death doom sound. But as I stated, Finnish death metal can also be quite ambitious and unorthodox, and a perfect example of that, of course, would be Demigod with their debut full-length album, Slumber of Sullen Eyes, because the guitar riffs, the composition and execution of all instrumentation is just absolutely sensational. It's one of those death metal albums that deserves the title of masterpiece. The guitar solos and the compositions, as I stated, are just second to none. And a lot of bands would really, follow this kind of approach when it comes to more somewhat atmospheric and cosmic, like, shredding types of odysseys when it comes to how they write their guitar riffs. and this is quite the staple to that approach. And of course, there's Convulse with their full-length album, World Without God, which is somewhat similar to that with Demigod's Slumber of Sullen Eyes, but I would say what it lacks in ambition with those Odyssey types of guitar riffs that Demigod was doing, it made up for with just like pure, utter aggression. If you enjoy anything by the past two bands I talked about, obviously check out names such as Depravity, Pertinence, and Funebrae. The real kicker, however, that makes Finnish death metal just so off the beaten path and unorthodox really just comes from this one album by Demolish, Nespith. If you really want to get nerdy and technical here, you can classify this as one of the earliest examples of avant-garde death metal or experimental death metal in this case, because everything about this is just so incredibly unhinged, abnormal, and abstract. The guitar riffs, how they're played, no matter who you hear discussing it, everyone's going to describe it differently. Like, everything's being played either backwards, it's very jagged, the tempo shifts and time signatures are just all over the place. That it's an acquired taste, but I really don't know what to compare this to, other than I've seen comparisons that it's like as if Voivod became a death metal band is one way of describing it. Then, of course, you have the vocals that are just so deep and guttural, resembling that of something of like a frog, that, again, it goes within the realms of like it's a really weird album that's an acquired taste. But if you're really looking for something different and one of a kind for death metal, you'll find it in Finland, that being with Demolish's Nespith. Other countries that were starting to get a death metal scene and following would be the United Kingdom. This is where Bolt Thrower, Paradise Lost, Cancer, and Benediction would form, along with the Netherlands as the Dutch started making some moves such as Thanatos, Gorefest, Asphyx, and God Dethroned. To even in Canada, I would say when it comes to the earliest forms of Canadian death metal, it was a lot more technical, that would kind of be the call before the storm of tech death bands a few years later. But noteworthy names that really were like harbingers for this approach would be stuff obviously like Cryptopsy, Gorguts, and Quo Vadis. Hell, even Mexico had somewhat of a scene going. Noteworthy names would be the Chasm, Xenotaph, and Shub-Nagarath, that really what their approach was taking what Finland was doing, but just adding in their own little twist on things. But, you know, very dense, heavy death metal that I feel like is often overlooked because you don't really think of Mexico being a hotspot for death metal. But they had some heavy hitters during this time. That's the thing with this, though. There is just so freaking much out there that I could be here for hours upon hours upon hours on end and not even scratch the surface of what there is to discuss. There are other things I want to mention here that's more in this miscellaneous sense because I didn't know where to pigeonhole them, but again, other standouts and personal favorites of mine would be, you know, Xenomorph with Imperial Regimes, really great primitive, savage death metal and Vein of Morbid Angel. Time Ghoul would showcase, even with only demos, that ambience and atmosphere plays a vital role into how heavy an album can sound. Cyanide, just really great death doom. Hypocrisy, another big name in Swedish death metal that during their mid-era put more like melody into their approach. Then you have Mortification, one of, if not the first death metal band to have pro-Christian lyrical themes, which was unheard of at the time as everything else was anti-religious. Phlebotomized, which was just really avant-garde, unorthodox death metal that when you look at the lineup of all the instruments they utilized was really different for their time. Mystic, one of the very first death metal bands that the lineup was just all women, to Apoplexy, which I believe they were from Slovakia if I'm not mistaken, that would have these like very different and somewhat odd like acoustic ballads during like some portions within their albums, which really shaked up the formula, along with Septic Flesh, which with their early albums, they're one of the first death metal bands not only to incorporate gothic elements, but also symphonic elements, that you could argue they were basically the emperor of death metal during their time. just as I stated, there was just so freaking much coming out during the 90s era. But with all that stated, this now leads into the conversation of, out of all places, Norway, which I know at this point Norway is known for Norwegian black metal, yes, but all of those Norwegian black metal bands that you know of, all of their musicians that made those bands, they started out playing death metal. Case in point, you have stuff like Old Funeral. This is a Both from Immortal along with other members of Immortal. To even Varg from Burzum was playing death metal together here. To Darkthrone with their debut full-length album Soulside Journey, in vein of what all these Swedish death metal bands were doing. Along with Thou Shalt Suffer, Isan from Emperor. His first ever band was in vein of death metal. To even Molested, I believe it's the members of Borknigar, played in a death metal band, and this is just really raw, aggressive, ground and pound, dissonant death metal that's easily my favorite out of all of the Norwegian death metal bands, and one of my all-time favorite death metal albums as a whole. If you do not know of this and you just want ultra barbaric death metal, listen to it immediately. What's interesting to point out here that I forgot to mention in the explicit history of black metal is all of these black metal bands that we cherish in Norway started out playing death metal, but a few years later got tired of it and made black metal that's a lot more harsh, raw, and lo-fi, mainly having to do with the fact that it was a rebellion against death metal, that death metal became too sterile, predictable, and it lost its edge, and black metal was like the next evolutionary step for, you know, metal to be extreme again, which I find, you know, kind of funny that this would be what led to, you know, Norwegian black metal being a thing. But to state that, you know, death metal as a whole became just like too sterile, that there was nothing, you know, all that extreme about it. Well, I understand that when you look at, you know, the bigger names for, like, you know, early 90s death metal, yeah, compared to early 90s black metal, it's, you know, easier to the ears. But there was, during this time, some really, you know, primitive death metal that doesn't get talked about. One band that comes to mind would be Autopsy, which I know they've been around since, like, the late 80s, and no, I didn't forget to mention them here. But yeah, obviously you look at stuff like Severed Survival, Mental Funeral, that's like very doomy, slow, gritty death metal, yes. But even their third and fourth album, that being Acts of the Unspeakable and Shit Fun, it's still really primitive death metal that I've always viewed them as kind of like this certain formation of like raw death metal that, to me, they are one of the more, like, you know, primitive takes for death metal, mainly having to do with the fact that Chris Rightford, their vocalist, has always had such a distinct signature sound. Along with Sadistic Intent, which this is some of the most primal and darkest death metal I feel like to come out during the 90s, that even though it's death metal as it's labeled, in terms of its overall just attitude and essence, it just reeks of like the raw black metal sound almost. Or Infestor with their 1994 full-length album To the Depths and Degradation. Like, oh, I can't even sugarcoat it. This album is so incredibly filthy. It's one of those death metal albums that everything about it, vocally, instrumentally, production-wise, vibe, atmosphere, is just hideous. It's so disgustingly raw to the point that I feel like I need to take a shower every time I listen to this just mammoth of a record. Also, along with everything by Pugnant Stench, which they were releasing albums during the early 90s, that just by album artwork and again presentation and sound is just really perverse stuff. Even though this changes absolutely nothing, as what, you know, a lot of the black metal musicians were thinking was over 30 years ago at this point, and what they're really referring to is the mass majority of death metal. I guess what I'm just trying to state here is, you know, there were still some heavy hitters in the underground that were really keeping it very primitive, extreme, and gritty for death metal. And those are just some examples that come to mind that I feel like, thanks to the internet, people are rediscovering and cherishing. Whew. Alright, so after discussing all of that, finally moving on within the timeline for death metal, when we get to the mid and late 90s, we're starting to notice now that there's more of a rise of technical death metal coming forth. One way you could describe technical death metal is it's a lot faster with the instrumentation on all fronts, whether it be the drumming, bass playing, or guitars, and it's a lot more intricate. So riffs aren't going to sound so one note. There's a lot more time signatures. It's just really like harder death metal, and I guess for mid and late 90s, this was like, I guess, the next evolutionary step to make death metal all the more extreme. I stated earlier on that when it came to the Canadian death metal scene, such as Cryptopsy or Gorguts, that it was kind of like the call before the storm of what, technical death metal would become. But to state as to where exactly it originates from, you could cite Canada, along with really a lot of the brutal death metal bands that were coming out, trying to expand upon death metal all the more to make it faster and, again, heavier, which, again, as I stated, I'm working on another video primarily with brutal death. Regardless, though, what we tend to notice is just more complexity, just more of everything being played. Thus, this is where bands like Nile come forth, and they would become, a really big respected name when you look at some of their earliest albums that leans more into brutal death metal territory, but in terms of the composition and songwriting, had a lot of technicality with it. Around this time in the late 90s, this is where Necrophagus would enter the timeline, which is either pronounced Necrophagus or Necrophagus. Someone was going to correct me in the comments and probably make fun of me for it. Regardless, when it comes to the dynamics of Necrophagus, it's very technical, intricate, and extremely complex. And that mainly has to do with the fact that when it comes to the mastermind behind this project, Mohammed, when he does the vocals and guitars, he's heavily inspired by classical music. So when it comes to the tempo, the overall pacing and compositions of classical, as intricate as it is, all of that's just being applied onto death metal. Thus it becomes very intricate and technical, and again, another big staple and monumental piece for tech death as a whole. One band, or really in this case 2 bands, I feel like need to be mentioned here that's more of a deep cut, but for me personally, it's some of the best you'll ever come across for this approach. Is, for one, you start off with Appalling Spawn with their debut Full and Thumb from 1998, where it's a mixture of technical progressive death grind, which I know is a freaking mouthful to say right there. But what I've always enjoyed so much about this is it's a perfect balance where, yeah, there's technicality and progressive tendencies with the composition and songwriting, but there's also another balance of, chaos and brutality to even everything out. So you get like this give and take with this approach that I've always found this to be quite the standout, which the band would technically follow it up, but with a new band, that being Lickatha Aflame, with their sole full-length album in the year 2000. It's basically like 3/4 of the members of Appalling Spawn carrying it over, and again, it's in that same approach of progressive technical death metal that resembles more of what Nile was doing, but there is just so many bells and whistles added to this. I know this may seem kind of overbearing at first because this album runs for a little over an hour long, but I can promise you that every single minute of this album is refreshing and extremely unique. Because as I stated, and people still state this to this day, it's nicknamed as happy metal because this is the only death metal album I've ever heard, regardless of tech death or any other niche little subgenre you can attach with it, that gives the feeling of enlightenment and optimism. It's the only one to ever do it, and it is such a unique experience to listen to. And I know this is a deep cut, but Lickatha Aflame is just such a special album to me, and one of the greatest death metal albums ever for my own personal bias. It's truly a one-of-a-kind experience to listen to. Other noteworthy names that were at the head helm of this new era of late 90s, early 2000s technical death metal would be Decapitated, Psychroptic, Origin, Spawn of Possession, and Decrypted Birth. If you were to focus primarily on technical death metal, yes, down the road years later, more bands would form, such as Beyond Creation, Archfire, and Flesh God Apocalypse, along with many others. It's just I feel like as to why it never gained a lot of popularity is while people will find fascination with it, and yeah, there's obviously an audience for it because it's still going to this day. I think the reason why it never really exploded anymore is, to be honest with you, technical death metal can be really overwhelming. Even stuff like Lickatha of Flame that I think to be really special and unique and a personal favorite of mine, I can totally understand as to why people would think it's a bit much. And that's the thing when you listen to any band that's labeled as technical death metal. There is just so much intricacy, and it's so technical, and there's so many different changes, and it's like, progressive death metal on crack, basically, that, you're not really latching onto one specific thing. So if you're looking for just absolute chaos and just lunacy of just things spiraling out of control all the time, yeah, this is for you, but that's not really something that has a big, wide audience. So technical death metal, though it has its place within death metal as a whole, I don't really think for what it is it's going to gain any more popularity because, as I stated, it's very overwhelming at times. I know I repeat this notion a lot, but when it comes to the turn of the millennia in the early 2000s, metal as a whole, regardless of subgenre, is in this really awkward time period because when it comes to death metal, it's kind of really not necessarily run its course, but really run out of steam. As technical death metal was becoming a thing, but that could only go so far, considering the fact that all it really did was just play everything faster and more complex, and there's only so far you can push that people are willing to listen to because, again, as I stated, it's really overbearing. Add to the fact, one thing I forgot to mention is one of the forefathers to death metal as a whole, Chuck Schuldiner and Death, they were on the cutting edge when it came to another forerunner to that for technical and progressive death metal. When you look at albums such as Human and Individual Thought Patterns, that it kind of painted the blueprints as well for bands to follow. It's just death metal was also hurting because in 2001, this is where Chuck Schuldiner would pass away. And again, one of the big, intellectual forerunners to that of death metal is gone. Death metal kind of feels like it's lost its sense of direction almost. Since death metal at this point is quite scattered in the early to mid 2000s, there's a lot of different directions that you could describe as to which way it went, or a lot of different viewpoints, so keep this in mind here. I'm just going off of what I kind of remember, considering I'm a millennial and I kind of grew up into appreciating death metal around like the mid to late 2000s. So how I've always looked at it is death metal kind of went in two different directions during this point. That there was either the tried and true death metal bands that persevered and kept up with, keeping that old school approach alive, which I'll discuss in a bit. But then there was also death metal bands that wanted to appeal to a wider audience that I would almost characterize this as more like accessible and approachable death metal. What I mean by accessible and approachable death metal is now... This is where death metal is, again, appealing to a wider audience. This is how I remember getting into death metal, that I know for the death metal purists, this is like false death metal. It's not true death metal. It's too soft. You have to understand that for my demographic age, growing up with the internet, that if we were to get into death metal, bands like Morbid Angel, Cannibal Corpse, and the likes are quite intimidating at first. And coming across death metal bands that, again, don't really have all the blood, guts, gore, and that evil type of sound might be something, approachable to a newer generation, which I know this is where it's like, millennials are such pussies or whatever. But still, this is just how I remember growing up into this with other individuals my age that got into it as well. One band that absolutely comes to mind here would be Children of Bodom, which I will never forget. In the 8th grade, I had a classmate show me this, telling me, this is a new band that I discovered. It's Children of Bodom. It's death metal. It's just some of the most intense stuff ever, which was around the time where Are You Dead Yet came out. Which, I'll be honest, I think Children of Bodom has some heavy hitters. I think their album Fall the Reaper from the early 2000s is quite good. But what Children of Bodom did musically is it's in vein of, Swedish death metal. It's very melodic, even though they're from Finland. And what they added was a lot of power metal, kind of like keys and guitar riffs that, again, made it accessible and approachable to, new ears and a new audience. I mean, if anything, when you listen to the album Are You Dead Yet, it's quite accessible, especially the title track on here that has more choruses, easier rhythms to follow along with. The keys have a lot more melody that's easier to the ears. And I've always kind of viewed it too that their frontman, Alexei, always looked more approachable, because I'm not trying to state this as an insult, because God rest his soul as he passed away a handful of years ago, but to me Alexei always kind of looked like the death metal version of Avril Lavigne, which I'm sorry, again, no insult to him, but he just always came off like more approachable looking. Thus, I feel like that's what attracted a wider audience. Then there's Amon Amarth, which I know they formed in the late 90s, but during the mid and late 2000s, they would gain a crap ton of traction that overall, in terms of commercial success, even today, they are huge hits. As what it is, yeah, musically it's melodic death metal, it's a bit accessible, it's a little infectious when it comes to the melodies, thus they have a lot of hooks, rhythms, and choirs and choruses that are infectious. Yes, but I really do feel like what led to their success and snowballed them to this just monumental commercial hit, again for death metal standards, is they played into their image, and I don't know if that was their intention, but they worked off of it clearly, as all their lyrical themes have to do with like Vikings and Viking mythology, yes. And the thing was, from what I remember when I was kind of into them and even seeing them live, people would hype them up that, oh, it's this death metal band that's all about Vikings, and the guys in the band look like Vikings, whether it be their long hair, to their beards, them actually being from Sweden, and all the music videos where they would play into it. I really do feel like that whole like Viking aesthetics that they played off of was easy to identify with, and again became very approachable for my demographic. The next inclusion might be me really leaning very hard on my personal experiences and biases here, but I think it fits within this topic of the timeline, that being the Black Dahlia murder, because I know I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit talking about stuff that they did in the early 2010s, but during the mid-2000s, like for example their album Nocturnal, it gained a lot of success and recognition, being signed to Metal Blade Records, and it's again in the vein of melodic death metal, very similar to that to At the Gates, which I know, oddly, the Black Dahlia murder was kind of compared to that to a lot of deathcore and metalcore bands, and I feel like that might have to do with the fact that the Black Dahlia murder inadvertently was appealing to a younger audience. Maybe it has to do with the fact that it's a bit accessible, or really the fact that they were really grinding a lot, releasing albums every other year, touring non-stop, and a lot of the bands that they were touring with were like maybe Whitechapel, The Red Chord, Suicide Silence, or something similar to that of like As I Lay Dying, like again, metalcore and deathcore bands. And their overall image, especially when it comes to Trevor Sternad, which rests his soul, was, more of like a bro, like a frat dude type of guy that seemed like he loved to party. He seemed to be very energetic and wholesome, and maybe that just resonated with the younger audience that was also appealing to that, to metalcore and deathcore. Another reason too could be in 2013, believe it or not, the Black Dahlia murder was on the Vans Warped Tour, a melodic death metal band on the Vans Warped Tour. Yeah, that was a thing during 2013, and I don't know, they were always a band that appealed to a younger audience, because I remember being in high school, seeing kids, around my age of 14, and young adult of 18 when I was graduating in my senior year, wearing the Black Dahlia murder shirts. Like, this was a death metal band appealing to a younger audience, and there's a lot of components that led to it. But I do feel like Trevor Sternad having a very, wholesome and inviting just persona that he just radiated non-stop, no matter if it was an interview, to him performing on stage, to him talking to fans. just made it more appealing and, again, approachable, just like the past two bands I've been talking about. Yet, I would say who is the unsung hero that really helped a newer generation of either millennials or Gen Z get into death metal wouldn't necessarily come from a band, but more so to a TV network, that being Adult Swim. I'm sure most individuals my age remember Adult Swim, as I believe it's still going on to this day, but how it really came of a thing was, I believe, like late 90s it started, and in the 2000s it started becoming more prevalent. It was an adult network station that would come on late night after, or at least on the Cartoon Network channel from what I remember, from around roughly like 11 at night to 5 in the morning or something like that. And typically it would play like anime or some of their original shows. But during some of the commercials, they'll have like just text pop up, whether it be like comedy or social commentary or things they would hype up that was happening on the network. And every once so often, maybe they'll have like a moment where the music kind of stops and abruptly like death metal's going to start playing with some of their comedy sketches. Going off of my own personal memory, I remember at times there were some commercials that on Adult Swim, they would just promote metal albums from Korn, All That Remains, Impending Doom. And I even heard at some point back in the mid-2000s, they even advertised Celtic Frost Monotheist. That, you know, I know some of that is metalcore, new metal, it doesn't matter. You don't come across commercials hyping up a metal album all that often, and Adult Swim would allow that when it came to all of their commercial breaks. Undoubtedly, what most people may know of the metal portion with Adult Swim is that I believe it started in the year 2006 up until 2013. They had a metal show called Metalocalypse. If you're a metal fan around my age and you know of Adult Swim, I know for a fact you know or have at least watched Metalocalypse at some point. I can bet my whole vinyl collection on it. I'm just that secure of this notion, because this was a show that played around with all, you know, metal subculture, even within obviously death metal subculture, that if you're a fan of death metal, you'll notice all of the jokes and subtleties like immediately. Even though it was a comedy show playing off of the tropes of, you know, metal culture and death metal, they still had a band, that being Deathlock, which they would release albums under that name. So you're watching a show, but also hearing a death metal band and death metal music. And when you consider the fact that Adult Swim is like this edgy network that was appealing to like young adults that wanted something really different and funny with forms of like, you know, either dark comedy or really just edgy, entertaining stuff, yeah, I don't doubt it for a second that this show definitely introduced quite a handful of people that never heard of death metal, what death metal can do. The only other show worth mentioning that came from Adult Swim that had some forms of death metal attached with it would be Mr. Pickles, as even though it's all about this violent, demonic dog that just like kills everyone and no one's aware of it besides the kid's grandfather, the show had death metal being played in their intro whenever you listen to it, of just the guy shouting out Mr. Pickles and guitar riffs and blast beats playing over it. But from what I remember, because this was released in like the mid-2010s, when I went to the Maryland Death Fest in 2016, believe it or not, there were individuals who worked for Adult Swim at the Maryland Death Fest with their own booth hyping up the show. So it's clear as day who's ever like, you know, a part of Adult Swim, whether it be the, you know, creator, CEO, or people involved with it, clearly there are individuals who are fans of death metal. Everything mentioned over the past handful of minutes is death metal being approachable to a newer audience. When it comes to the more underground death metal that was really true to its original sound, one thing I've noticed about death metal overall is it's very stubborn. Not in a negative sense, but really trying its best to dig its claws as deep and hard as it can into its roots, not changing. Thick or thin, the death metal sound would never fade away. And I think two bands we need to really thank for showcasing that throughout their whole careers, when they started in the early 90s through the 2000s to even present day, they've really just been consistent, sticking to one style to appeal to the, die-hard death metal fans. That, of course, being Incantation and Immolation. Two absolute essentials when it comes to everything and anything that has to do with death metal. And while their early albums in the 90s are considered to be classic and essentials that are highly celebrated, what's important about these guys is no matter what, thick and thin, they never really changed their sound. If we're talking solely on consistency with quality and sound, Immolation and Incantation are like the two biggest names, I honestly feel like, that was always around like in the underground death metal scene. They never really gained a lot of commercial success, but they're successful enough that they sell records because of fan recognition. But yeah, late 90s, early 2000s, mid 2000s, late 2000s, 2010s to even present day, both of these bands always kept it true to their sound, and as I stated, consistency is what they showcased time and time again. It's also worth mentioning that during the early 2000s, this would be the start of the death metal revitalism, or what some people consider as the new wave of old school death metal, which I know kind of sounds like an oxymoron there. But really all it was is, look at the bands of the past, regardless of late 80s, early 90s, all that stuff I've been talking about, and just take that sound and apply it to, the new millennia of the 2000s. And one of the first bands to really ever do that would be Bloodbath. Their debut album, Resurrection Through Carnage, showcases right up front from their sound and image of how much inspiration they take from like old school Swedish death metal, as it's a supergroup death metal band that consists of members of both Opeth and Catatonia at the time. And really all they wanted, or when they formed the band, is they just wanted to bring back old school death metal. It's a bunch of guys drinking that wanted to bring back that sound that they miss. And as I stated, you can notice right up front how much they take influence from just the classics. From the band's logo, their Bloodbath font, that's in reference to the Gorment band logo that's eerily similar to it, to their sound of that buzzsaw-like guitar riff, again taking influence from Dismember, Entombed, Grave, and again just bringing that on to a new millennia. Since the mindset of death metal, at least when it comes to all the bands and musicians coming forth at this point, was really trying to capture the old school sound and the whole revitalism movement was happening, really what we started to get towards the late 2000s and really all of the 2010s to hell, even present day, is all of these bands were looking at all of the legacy acts from the past, to even some of the gems or more obscure names that had signature sounds, look at it as if it was blueprints and try to replicate it for present day, that basically any like little niche or signature band you can think of would be replicated tenfold. That being the case, because according to Discogs, when you look at this graph of all the albums that were released by decades, from the 1990s to the 2000s and 2010s, there would always be this steady increase of at least roughly 50% more bands and albums coming out, that death metal seemed to just consistently grow. So in short, when it comes to this portion of the video talking about all of these bands from late 2000s and the 2010s that were revitalizing death metal, if it was like impossible to talk about everything coming out of the 90s, I felt like it would have taken hours to discuss everything bit by bit. This is absolutely impossible, so please understand I cannot talk about everything here especially. One death metal band that comes to mind that during the late 2000s and 2010s era found a lot of success, and they really weren't doing anything all that groundbreaking, but just appealed to a lot of people, would be Dying Fetus. I remember at this point now, this is where they had the music video for Your Treachery Will Die With You, which is how I discovered them. And I started noticing that they would gain a lot of attention, which I kind of thought at first it was their band name being so upfront and bold with the lettering. But really what I think we got to credit Dying Fetus for with their success is not only were they just consistent all the time, but they grinded it out so hard. And what I mean by that is they would tour literally non-stop, Dying Fetus was always on tour, going from all over the States to Europe, back and forth, just like all the time. I've never really seen Dying Fetus not be active, doing at least something, releasing albums on a consistent basis, and just finding a lot of success because of just never really stopping, showcasing that if you really put all of this hard work in death metal, as oversaturated and overblown as it started to get, you could still find success with it. Yeah, if we're primarily focusing on 2010's death metal and what band really got the most amount of success and recognition among the fans, easily that would go to Blood Incantation. Their approach to death metal from day one was taking influence obviously from all different death metal from the past, and it wasn't just one particular scene, sound, or time period that they were focusing on, but really just all of the classics that you can think of old school death metal. Blood Incantation would apply to their formula. So obviously they would be compared to that, to maybe Morbid Angel or Time Ghoul, Death, a lot of the American death metal, but also be compared to a lot of the Finnish death metal such as Demigod, Convulse, Demolich, and I really do believe their approach to just applying it to all different forms of death metal would appeal to the death metal connoisseur that just enjoys death metal as a whole. And sure, as the years went on, they would kind of experiment a little bit more, bringing in other influences, as I believe their later stuff would start to have Tangerine Dream influences. So I really do feel like Blood Incantation's formula of just applying their sound to just a wide array of all different death metal, different scenes within death metal's history worked in their favor. The same members of Blood Incantation would also start a year later Spectral Voice, which this band would also find a lot of success and fan recognition because, again, it's taken now the style of Death Doom, but just taken influence from all different Death Doom bands. So again, Finland, once again, such as Amorphis or Ripikulu is kind of noticeable here, but also was very atmospheric and had a lot of ambient kind of passages throughout it. Thus, it would also be compared to Disembowelment, a very respected Death Doom band. Tomb Mold would also find success with this approach, as again, it's death metal looking at bands of the past as a blueprint to how they can apply it for today. Thus, you would notice that their formula is a mixture of a lot of old school death metal from the United States, from Finland, and Sweden, again, all kind of blended together in this big melting pot of different styles of death metal playing off of each other's strengths. And this would kind of be like the winning formula, I would say, for the most part when it comes to standouts within this decade. It wasn't just one particular style, but if you can melt together all these different influences from all different areas of certain points within death metal, of locations and scenes, you would appeal to probably more death metal fans because of it. There are literally too many bands to name that would then take this approach for like modern or old school death metal revivalist types of ideas, but some that come to mind that clearly was looking at death metal from the past and taking all different ideas from either different time periods or different scenes of countries would be the following, such as Father Befouled, Crucimentum, Undergang, Ascended Dead, Triumvir Foul, one of my personal favorites, Dead Congregation, Funebrarum, to even Horrendous, which I know they went for more of like this progressive technical approach with some of their newer albums, to even this band called Cathelist, which has only done one full length at the moment, but really what makes them quite special is they're really one of the only bands to ever truly capture the unique and very unorthodox approach that Demolich did. It's a safe bet to say that most of the death metal being released in the 2010s was this approach of the old school revitalism, but that really wasn't the only ideas or signature tropes that were starting to be, brought forth again within this style of music, because I would also state this is where the whole like dissonant death metal type of approach would start to gain a lot more traction. To some, dissonant death metal is its own unique subgenre. To others, it's just basically death metal with a bunch of reverb attached with it when it comes to the production value. Regardless, it's noticeable among the fan base. And I would state one band, or really two bands I should state, that really started to popularize it or really make it, something that paint out the blueprints would of course be Gorguts that I've talked about earlier, and one of my all-time favorite death metal bands, Portal. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Portal, mainly because I've already done a video all about them a few years ago. But Portal's approach was always a bit more, unique and avant-garde, because it wasn't so much of this idea of death metal at the forefront of aggression. It was always playing death metal that was still pulverizing, but off in the distance. If there's this monster lurking out there, and they would use a lot of the reverb and dissonant guitar riffs to their advantage to paint out, that sound and image that they were going for. And I think it only intensified more when they kind of applied it with their stage attire and gimmick at live shows. Thus, this is where dissonant death metal started to branch out a little bit more when you get to the 2010s. Some noteworthy names here that definitely took this dissonant sound with their approach and songwriting would be stuff like Ulcerate, that would be a little bit more technical with their approach. That I've always found Ulcerate to basically be the death metal version of Deathspell Omega, how they sounded, which was always cool. Then you had Evangelists that would mix together forms of black metal and some other forms of experimentation with their approach to death metal. That what they experimented with is they would utilize saxophone into their sound and make all that dissonance types of atmospheres and ambience really play off like a saxophone, which is pretty unique. Then you have stuff like Abyssal, Convults, Mitochondrion, and Apparatus. Coming up now on the late 2010s to present day, death metal is as big really as ever before when it comes to its overall scene, as even more death metal is being pumped out. We're only halfway through this decade, and already the numbers are showcasing that just as much to even more death metal may be released by the decade's end. As for overall standouts, one that comes to mind that they've been around for quite a while, but only really as of recently, the past 10 years, they've gained a lot more traction, would be Cattle Decapitation. Travis Ryan's vocals have always been signature, but it's, again, as the past 10 years he started doing clean singing or more of like this grindy like of yelling that he does that really separates them from the rest of the pack. They're even considered to be, even on the Metal Archives, as progressive death grind, which is not really something you come across, especially with anything that's relating to do with grindcore of any such. And I feel like because of it being extreme but also a little bit unorthodox, at least with the vocal department, it's really separated Cattle Decapitation from the rest of the herd. Then you got Pissgrave, who's released an album earlier this year, and this is just really primitive, filthy, grotesque, and extremely explicit death metal, especially when it comes to their album artwork, is what they're kind of known for, which I know is absolutely nothing new or groundbreaking for death metal standards. But Pissgrave, I think, just has made it so upfront, and they've connected with the right people at the right time, that, yeah, really all it is just, primitive death metal. There's really nothing else to say about it. And the vocal department, with some of the effects they use, can be traced back to, like, early Carcass and such. But if you just want disgusting death metal, as basic of a description as that is, Pissgrave has it, like, literally with every single note that they play. As for the whole old school death metal revitalism, that's still going strong to this day, I would state. A great example of it would be the band Gruesome, that literally just from the album artwork and the band logo, it is painfully obvious that they are trying to bring back the sound of old school death with, the album Scream Bloody Gore, Leprosy, and Spiritual Healing. That's what they're going for with this approach. And when it comes to the vocals, instrumentation, production, again, image and aesthetics, it's just so obvious. You'd have to be tone deaf not to notice the influences of death that they take. I can state with confidence that the future of death metal, the sound that everyone admires about it, will be continued on for decades to come, because there are still bands such as Undeath, 200 Stab Wounds, Sanguis Sugabog, Fulci, Fluids, that, again, all they're really doing is just taking death metal as it was and just applying it still for, today's audience. Thus, I don't really feel like death metal is really going anywhere. Maybe it won't have the same amount of success that it did decades ago in the 90s in terms of like all the controversy and all the records being sold, but just for the enjoyment of this existing, it's still going strong, make no mistake about it. Nearing the end of this video, I'm very much aware that when it comes to present day death metal, there are still so many other bands I can talk about making moves. They might not be groundbreaking or doing really anything different from the bands I just mentioned a minute ago, but that should all showcase to you, to anyone who's about to type, why didn't you include this band, that it's just still ever growing. It's such a strong scene that it seems like no matter what you talk about, no matter how much you cover, there's always more coming out. There's always something else that you just didn't have time to listen to. And I do feel like, again, that's as to why the death metal scene and sound isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and as to why I have such confidence that for decades to come, it's going to be around. The fan base is definitely some of the most die-hard individuals I've ever talked to and met when it comes to how this music is still going. That when it comes to either festivals, shows, interviews, books, videos, music videos, whatever, to even people here on YouTube talking about it, it's always intrigued me that people now, in terms of like, you know, reaching either their 50s or 60s, which I'm not trying to talk down to anyone older than me, is that they are still so into it. They're still buying this stuff like non-stop. They're still talking about what's coming out, or just cherishing all that came out before and really finding fascination with bands that carry it. Death metal is just something that I feel like is meant for people to just get lost in terms of either the lyrical themes, its powerful sound, to its ever-growing scene. Death metal is definitely something that just requires, like, not really discipline, but more of this ultra fascination with it, like this dedication that you don't just dip your toes in. You go head first in, and you just keep going more and more down the ever so never-ending abyss of death metal. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun making it. Definitely let me know your thoughts about death metal as a whole, as I'm sure there's some stuff, or just stuff overall, that I didn't mention that could be quite important to its history. Definitely let me know in the comments. Other than that, guys, like always, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.